Green. I either feel like Tony Stark or, is that his first name? Iron Man?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tony Stark. Press conference. We're starting chapter 5 of Daniel, verses 1 to 12. We are, yeah. Each generation examines itself and says, look how much better we are now compared to the past. This is especially true in the area of health and medicine. We take vaccines for granted when hundreds of thousands of people died of things like smallpox and typhoid fever. And there was polio, which was prevalent during my lifetime. But along with these life-saving discoveries came opportunities for other people to rob people of their money and their lives. No matter what, we have to recall that Satan loves to counterfeit everything God does. Loves to counterfeit it. Whatever we see that's good and it's from God, there's going to be some despicable satanic thing that Satan's going to do to counterfeit it. In the end, man was born under the curse of sin, handed down from Adam's rebellion. And by the way, it's important to note that doesn't mean, when I say that man was born under the curse of sin handed down from Adam, that doesn't mean that I'm under a spell and I can't say no. That's not what that means. That means that we have and the only word somebody can think of a better word, I'm open for it, but we have a propensity. We have a leaning.
We have a bent.
We have a bent. A bent toward
A predilection.
Toward disobeying authority.
Desire. A yearning.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Or the thesaurus out.
A leaning.
Yes. And we can of course say no. Well, was that Nancy Reagan that said just say no?
Say no to drugs.
Just say no. Well, she obviously was. I mean, it was a good thought. It was a good thought. A little harder than just say no. Even though mankind has accomplished many good things, there's also the temptation to do evil, and that's exactly what we were just talking about. Having the bent toward being disobeying God and and even if you don't even care about God, but doing things that you know are not right. And there isn't a person that say robs somebody or breaks into their house and steals their stuff that believes somehow that's okay. Now they may in their mind say, oh, it's all right for me to steal from Walmart because they're a big corporation. And therefore, I'm the little guy and they owe it to me. And you've heard all of that on the news. It wasn't that long ago that they were saying that same kind of crap. It's wrong, and you knew it was wrong. You don't take somebody else's stuff. None of this, by the way, is ever going to change until Jesus returns and completes what he started in our lives. And this is, to me, I find this so unbelievable. Even when Jesus rules for 1,000 years, and we know about the millennial kingdom, when Jesus will be here physically, at least, and there are people that don't believe this, but that's fine. It can be wrong, it's okay. When he rules on his throne in Jerusalem for 1,000 years, think about 1,000 years. This country, how old are we?
Not that old.
Not even 300 years.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten anywhere close. But even when he rules and reigns, there are going to be people that choose to reject him. Now, that's not going to be those of us that returned with Jesus to rule and reign with him, but we're talking about the lost that are still there. It's hard to believe that. It's really hard to believe that.
It's kind of like people who don't respect whatever president's in office.
Mm-hmm.
No, but I'm just saying, there's a person that God put in charge,
Right?
and not everybody respects the leader.
Sure.
That's on a small scale compared to.
Yeah.
To Jesus.
I'm sure a lot of people will say, well, how do we know he's really Jesus? It's just the same old arguments. But my point is that that bent toward doing evil, toward being disobedient, is going to remain there until the time comes that there is a new heaven and a new earth created. Until we are completely sanctified, made holy, so anyway, when we last witnessed King Nebuchadnezzar, by the way, I finally memorized how to spell his name. I mean, you write that.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, you're right. You write that, and is it in spell check? I can't remember.
Yeah, some of them, yeah.
Some of those ancient names are in spell check, but
No, I did by a vowel.
yeah, a lot of vowels. So when we were last with the king, he had come to his senses. It says he looked up to the sky, and his senses returned. So he was, and I can't even imagine this. He had the mind of an animal. 1 second, and then his human mind returned, and he came back to his senses. So think of somebody who's absolutely, completely in their own little world. 1 second, and then all of a sudden they're back, and maybe they don't even remember what it was like to be back. So anyway, so he's come back to his senses. We're told that the nobles and his advisors and whatever sought him out to put him back on the throne. And he was really promised that after, how many years was it?
7.
After 7 years, he would recognize the fact that God was sovereign over all men of all kingdoms in the whole world. There's just nothing you can do about it. That's just the way it is. He ruled for 43 years altogether, from the time his father died and he became king, until the day that he died. It was 43 years. And it ended in the year 582 BC. Don't need to write that on your calendar.
And the last thing he said is, those who walk in pride, God is able to put down.
One of his successors was named that B word. What is that?
Belshazzar.
Belshazzar. And he was called the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but the word son can mean
Grandson.
yeah, it can mean other things other than hey Sean, the green light's off on the camera. I don't know what that means, but you can just leave it or whatever you want to do. I just happened to notice it. Yeah, it can mean, but you know what? There's so many verses in there that are speaking of your father. The queen says, "Your father, the king, said thus and so." But again, we're taking in English now. The green lights now it's red. The green
It's recording now, it's red now. This is the first time it's been red?
yeah, it was green before.
Okay.
Well, whatever. We'll find out.
Yeah, no, I'm figuring the camera out too, so.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure, that's fine. So we're taking an English translation of a word, and it really doesn't. In the end, it doesn't really matter whether he was actually the son of Nebuchadnezzar or whether it was his grandson, or it can also mean his successor. So it can mean all of those things.
Nebuchadnezzar was the patriarch, essentially. He was the offspring of the patriarch, right?
Yeah, so you might be able to say it that way.
The father.
What matters is what took place during a banquet that Belshazzar held. And of course they were all, it's kind of like you say to yourself, what should we do this weekend? Oh, well, let's see. Let's have a banquet. And let's have it be a drunken banquet. Oh, but is there any other kind? O king, live forever? This is the kind of thing we do all the time.
We're going to dress up and wear robes.
Yeah. That in verse 1, there was a great banquet. It was held for 1,000. It's kind of like I can hear him saying, "Oh, I want to send out invitations to 1,000 of my best friends." And it says it was held for 1,000 of his noblemen. So, and of course, soon that, and this was usually a multi-day kind of thing. This wasn't, oh, we're going to have it between 3 and 6. We're going to have the banquet. No, this could go on for days.
Weddings are like 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this could be.
That's one heck of a hangover.
And of course it soon they became drunk, and they probably were getting a little out of control. And by the way, it does mention later that their wives were there, and their concubines were there, which is we don't really use that word. I guess the closest word would be mistress. If you were a wealthy person, had a mistress or several. Well, they had thousands.
Isn't marriage hard enough?
Yeah. And so they were having this feast, and it ended with the order that he made to bring out the golden and the silver goblets which had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, right? He'd hauled all that stuff, and he had put it in, I think a lot of it was put into the temple for their god, for Marduk. Soon, and that's verse 2, soon everyone, including the concubines, were drinking out of these sacred vessels. They weren't sacred to them. Verse 3, as they drank their wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. And, you know, anybody who has another god, raise your hand, we'll drink to him too.
I'm just gonna get covered good, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was at this point that the fingers of a human hand appeared. This is in verse 5. And wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace, are there consequences for our actions? The king's about to find out. It's interesting because one of the phrases that sometimes we use is, can't you read the writing on the wall?
Yeah.
Isn't it clear to you? And we're quoting somebody that's thousands of years.
Whether he did or he didn't, he produced the right result, which is the excrement.
Yeah, exactly. Even though he was full of wine, his face turned pale and fear took over his body.
Smartest thing he did.
Yeah, that was an emotional
Mine
response.
says his knees knocked together.
Yeah. In verse 6, it tells us that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. I don't know if anybody ever experienced having your knees knock?
Yeah.
I had it. It wasn't for fear, but it was due to the cold.
It was due to Special Forces School.
We were in. You want to know when that was? I'll tell you. We were in the airport coming back from Hawaii, and we hadn't been back in a long time, and we were in the San Francisco airport, and it was normal, 50, 55 degrees or whatever in the airport. And I'm walking there, and my knees are shaking, my teeth are chattering, I can't stop. Really, my body said, where are we and what are you doing here? We belong where it's warm, not here. So, I mean, this is not just a fairy tale. This kind of thing happens. Your body can do it. It was bad enough to witness the handwriting, but he had no idea what was being written. If he had known what was being written, he definitely would not have liked it. But he saw that writing on the wall, and what? Like Nebuchadnezzar before him, what's the first thing you figured that this king did? He called his astrologers and his diviners, and he gave them, because he wanted some answers, right? He called anybody who was a wise man, he called them. After all, this was a spiritual matter. This was something metaphysical, whatever. It was beyond the physical. I mean, you just don't see a hand.
Not something you see every day.
No. And then he of course said the same thing to these guys. He offered them a great reward if only they could interpret the message on the wall. You know, the same old thing that everybody gets offered. I'll give you gold chains and a purple cloak and I'll elevate you to be the third highest in the kingdom. When we were watching the story of Esther, they did the same thing with her uncle, Mordecai. And it's just a normal thing. But just as they couldn't interpret the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar, and as you will recall, they kind of shrugged their shoulders when Nebuchadnezzar brought them in, saying, we have no idea. First tell us what the dream was, remember? And then we'll tell you the interpretation. We'll make something up. King was smarter than that. This is kind of going to be a great comparison, because this is Nebuchadnezzar, who was a Chaldean. He was a leader of Babylonia, and then the next king that comes along after this, when the Medes and the Persians took over, this is Darius, and we're gonna get into him in lessons to come. They had no idea. All of these wise men, they had no idea what the writing on the wall said, and that made the king's condition even worse. Everybody was baffled. Nobody had any clue what that was. That was verse 9. Only the queen, and they don't say which queen, whether it was Belshazzar's wife, queen, or I guess it's possible it might have been Nebuchadnezzar's, but I kind of don't, that doesn't seem quite right. But only the queen knew who to call for help. It's interesting that she knew the story of Daniel's history of interpreting the dreams of his father. She knew the story of how Daniel was finally the one that saved the day and interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It's sad that the knowledge about the one living and true God was never passed on from Nebuchadnezzar to his son or grandson, whatever. So Belshazzar learned the hard way. In fact, by the time this happens, he's not getting a second chance like Nebuchadnezzar did.
I have a feeling the queens of those days knew who had real power.
Yeah, and they were the ones that had the power, I think.
Yeah, but a different kind of power.
Mm-hmm. The queen told him, Belshazzar, the whole story of how he had been made head. Daniel had been made head of the magicians, the enchanters, the astrologers, and the diviners.
Yeah, this was well after that, right?
What's that?
This is Daniel interpreted those dreams. This was after that.
Yeah, this is.
Yeah.
Way after. Way later.
Yeah, this is after. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar's long gone.
Yeah, he's an old man, or died.
No, he's died.
I mean, Daniel was an old man.
Yeah, and Daniel's no longer young.
Yeah.
She also told him of Daniel's ability to understand and interpret dreams and to solve difficult problems. Aha, that little light must have went on in Belshazzar's.
Still a well-known thing in those days.
Yeah.
It must be a much different time.
Verse 12. So he has this problem. Even if the king had heard the stories of Daniel and his abilities before, given to him from God, the abilities, he would have to believe them in order to receive the wisdom which God was willing to give him. In other words, it's not enough to just say, oh, okay, yeah, I heard that story. I don't believe it, but maybe he'll help me.
Ooh.
No, you've got to believe in it in order to receive. It's not enough for us to hear the truth of God. We must believe it and apply it to our lives. God wants us to be doers, not just hearers. Belshazzar was suffering from pride, seems to be a common trait among all these kings,
It's the one that kills you.
just as his father had. He was about to lose everything, and it was by his own doing that this was going to happen. Now, think back. Think back to the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar had built. And it sat out in the middle of, it says, in the middle of the plains, so this flat, open area with nothing around it. And here's this statue. And remember when Daniel gave the interpretation of the meaning of the statue. The head of gold was who? Nebuchadnezzar, that's the head of gold, represented Nebuchadnezzar. And then the next down from your head, of course, are your two shoulders, too. And so when this kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar's passed away, there would be, that kingdom that was left over would be divided into two, which was the Medes and the Persians. And that's what's coming up next. And so I'm sure it would be so interesting to know how much he understood of what Daniel had told him. Because here he's hearing about how his kingdom is going away, and he's thinking, well, yeah, someday I'm going to die and the kingdom will go away. But he's not in. And this is what's great about history. We have this hindsight. We can look back and we can see what went on, and we can say, oh, Medes and the Persians, okay. And so that's why there were all these other kings afterward. And what was the common thread that continued through all of these? Daniel was there. Daniel was recognized as being a wise person who had this, as they said, the spirit of the gods with him. And he was there. He was there from Nebuchadnezzar. He was there through Belshazzar. And now he's going to be there through the Medes and the Persians. When we watched, I guess it was at my place, we watched the story of Daniel, and we kind of got the impression, or you get the impression, even though it's not those movies they're not necessarily Hollywood productions, but they're not necessarily totally biblical.
Right.
But you did get the idea that he was very well respected, even though he didn't have to be a man of power like the kings were. He was one of...
He's one chosen by God, obviously.
Yeah.
He's the one that can only do what he could do.
That's right, and what was the thing that Daniel always did before he interpreted anything?
Prayed.
He prayed to God, and he asked God to give him
Wisdom.
the wisdom to know what this was, and the same thing was going to be true
True wise man.
with this writing on the wall.
I think it's interesting though when he does bring him before the king, and the king doesn't acknowledge that his dad is great or any of that. He's like, oh, are you one of the exiles we brought? You're like, he's
Right.
still insolent at that point.
Yeah, sure is.
A real wise man knows he doesn't have the